The hiss of shallots hitting hot grapeseed oil was a prayer. The rhythmic chop of a santoku knife against a worn maple block was a hymn. In the controlled chaos of the kitchen at Ori, Tokyo's most notoriously exclusive restaurant, Naomi found her sanctuary. Here, she was not a name, not a wife, not a secret. She was just a pair of hands, quick and sure, translating the executive chef's vision into reality. At 20 years old, she was the youngest chef on the line, and the only one whose skin was the color of rich, dark soil in a room of pale faces. It didn't matter. The language of a kitchen was universal: heat, pressure, and precision. And in that language, Naomi was fluent. Her white chef's jacket was a canvas, pristine and stark against her skin. It was her armor, a symbol of the life she was trying to build for herself, separate from the one that waited for her at home in a silent, sprawling penthouse overlooking the city. A life of silk and shadows. A life belonging to Akio Tanaka. New girl. The voice cut through the symphony of the kitchen, sharp and dissonant. Evelyn Reed, the restaurant's manager, stood with her arms crossed, her thin lips pursed into a permanent sneer. She was a woman who wielded her minor authority like a weapon, and she'd had her sights on Naomi since day one. "It's Naomi," she replied, her voice even, her eyes never leaving the pan of searing scallops before her. She gave them a practiced toss, the flames licking up in a bright, beautiful flare. "I don't care what it is," Evelyn snapped, stepping closer. The air around her always felt tight, starved of oxygen. "Chef Du Bois wants the lobster bisque for table 7.
Now.
Not when you're done playing with your little fireworks." Naomi plated the scallops with a delicate flick of her wrist, arranging them in a perfect fan. "The bisque is holding at temperature. I'm on plating. Marco is on pass." She gestured with her chin toward the burly sous chef at the end of the line. It was the wrong thing to say. It was a fact, a simple statement of kitchen hierarchy, but to Evelyn it was a challenge. A shadow crossed the manager's face. "Are you talking back to me?" "I'm clarifying the workflow," Naomi said, her tone still maddeningly calm. She wiped the rim of the plate with a clean cloth. "Order up." Evelyn's eyes narrowed to slits. She moved toward the pass, where a large tureen of the creamy, fragrant bisque sat under a heat lamp. Her movements were jerky, agitated. She picked up the ladle, her knuckles white. "Table 7 has been waiting. Because of you." She scooped a ladleful of the steaming, orange-tinted soup. And then, in a movement that was too quick to be a clumsy accident and too slow to be anything but deliberate, she turned. The ladle tilted. A wave of scalding liquid cascaded down the front of Naomi's immaculate white jacket. Heat bloomed across her chest, a shocking, searing pain. The thick fabric of the coat offered some protection, but the bisque was hot enough to bite, to leave a mark. It soaked through instantly, clinging to her skin. A collective gasp went through the kitchen. Every cook, every prep hand, froze. The symphony had stopped. Evelyn held the dripping ladle, a look of feigned horror on her face that was almost comical. "Oh my goodness," she said, her voice dripping with saccharine insincerity. "I am so sorry. So clumsy of me." Naomi didn't flinch. She didn't cry out. She stood perfectly still, the steam rising from the ruin of her uniform. Her gaze was fixed on Evelyn's face. The pain was a dull, angry throb beneath the surface, but something else was rising faster. A cold, quiet rage she had learned to master, to swallow down until it was a hard, polished stone in her gut. She had learned it from the master of such things. "It's fine," Naomi said, her voice a low whisper. The words felt like ash in her mouth. She began to unbutton the stained jacket, her movements measured and calm. Underneath, her black undershirt was soaked through, and the skin of her sternum was an angry, blossoming red. "You should go put some cold water on that," Evelyn said, setting the ladle down with a clatter. There was a glint of triumph in her eyes. She had won. She had marked her territory, sullied the new girl's perfect composure. Naomi said nothing. She balled up the soiled jacket, the expensive fabric now smelling of lobster and cream and petty cruelty. She walked past the silent line of her colleagues, past the gaping stairs, and pushed through the swinging doors into the back corridor. She did not see the man at a secluded table in the corner of the dining room, the one who had been watching the kitchen doors all evening. He was unremarkable in a simple dark suit, a ghost at the feast. He saw Naomi exit. He saw the dark, wet stain on her white uniform. He waited a beat, then quietly placed a black credit card on the table, rose, and walked out into the Tokyo night. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over a single contact. The call he made was short, his words precise and deferential, spoken in a language of absolute loyalty. He reported what he had seen. An insult. A burn. An act of disrespect against the wife of the Oyabun. Naomi stood in the staff locker room, letting cold water run over the angry red patch on her skin. The sting was sharp, a physical reminder of the humiliation. It wasn't the pain that bothered her. It was the violation. Her kitchen, her sanctuary, had been breached. Evelyn's petty act had thrown a rock into the placid pool of the life Naomi was trying to create, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the ripples were already on their way. She had made a deal with Akio. She could have this job, this semblance of normalcy, under one condition, that she remain invisible, that she never draw the kind of attention that could connect her to him. A burn from a clumsy manager was nothing, but a deliberate act of malice? That was different. Disrespect, in Akio's world, was a currency of its own. It was a debt that was always collected. She looked at her reflection in the small, cracked mirror, at the flush of red on her brown skin. She had wanted to prove she could exist outside of his gilded cage, that she was more than just Tanaka's wife. Now, Evelyn's pathetic power play was about to drag his world crashing into hers. She closed her eyes, and all she could see was the intricate, terrifying beauty of the dragon tattoo that covered Akio's back, a creature of silent, coiled power, waiting for a reason to strike. And Evelyn Reed had just given it one. The air in the restaurant changed before he even walked in. It was a palpable shift, a sudden drop in pressure, as if the building itself were holding its breath. The cheerful chatter of the diners faltered. The clinking of silverware seemed to grow louder in the ensuing quiet. Naomi, having changed into a spare, ill-fitting jacket, felled it from the kitchen. A primal instinct hummed under her skin, an alarm she had learned to recognize. He was here. When the doors to Ori swung open, they did so without a sound. Akio Tanaka did not make entrances. He simply appeared, occupying space with an intensity that warped the reality around him. He was flanked by two men, both silent and severe in their dark suits, but they were merely extensions of his will. All eyes were on him. He wore a custom-tailored suit of charcoal wool that seemed to absorb the light. His white shirt was so crisp it looked sharp to the touch, his tie a slash of black silk. There was no visible weapon, no overt threat. There was only the perfect, lethal stillness of him. His face was a mask of aristocratic calm, all sharp angles and unreadable shadows. His dark eyes swept the room once, dismissing everything in it, until they landed on the swinging doors to the kitchen. Evelyn Reed, seeing the sudden hush and the arrival of a man who radiated such immense wealth and power, immediately smoothed her dress and pasted on her most professional smile. She glided toward him, a hostess drawn to a flame. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to Ori. Do you have a reservation?" Akio's gaze passed over her as if she were a piece of furniture. He took a step forward, and she instinctively took a step back. His focus was entirely on the kitchen. He walked toward it, his footsteps silent on the polished floor. He pushed the door open. The kitchen, which had been tentatively returning to its rhythm, fell silent once more. Every eye was on him. He scanned the line of chefs, his expression unchanging, until his eyes found Naomi. He saw the too large jacket she wore, the way she held herself with a new, rigid tension. His gaze dropped to her chest, where the top button of the jacket was undone, and he could see the faint red mark on her skin just above her undershirt. A muscle in his jaw clenched, the only sign of the storm brewing beneath his placid surface. He walked toward her, moving through the cramped, cluttered kitchen with an unnerving grace. The other chefs practically melted out of his way. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she could smell the clean, cold scent of his cologne, a hint of cedar and smoke. He didn't speak. He simply looked at her, his eyes searching hers. In them, she saw not just anger, but something deeper. A flicker of that old, familiar pain, the shame he carried for things he could not prevent. "Are you hurt?" he finally asked. His voice was a low murmur, a sound meant only for her, yet it carried the weight of an imperial command. "I'm fine," she lied, her voice barely a whisper. He lifted a hand, his long, elegant fingers hesitating for a fraction of a second before gently touching the fabric of her jacket, just over the burn. His touch was featherlight, yet it sent a jolt through her. It was a question, an assessment, a claim. Behind them, Evelyn Reed bustled into the kitchen, her face flushed with indignation. "Sir, I'm sorry, but this is a staff-only area. You can't be in here." Akio did not turn. He did not acknowledge her existence in any way. His attention remained entirely on Naomi. "Who did this?" he asked, his voice still quiet, but now laced with a thread of steel. Naomi's heart hammered against her ribs. This was the moment her two worlds collided and shattered. She could protect Evelyn, lie, and say it was an accident. But the lie would be a betrayal of him, and he would know. He always knew. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod in Evelyn's direction. That was all it took. Akio's hand dropped from her jacket. He turned his head slowly, his dark, bottomless eyes finally landing on the manager. Evelyn, who had been about to protest again, froze. The full force of his presence hit her, and the color drained from her face. She saw, for the first time, that she was not dealing with a wealthy patron. She was dealing with a predator. "You," Akio said. The single word was flat, cold, and heavy with consequence. Evelyn swallowed, her bravado crumbling into dust. I'm the manager here. If there's a problem, you will step outside," Akio commanded. It was not a request. He then looked at the executive chef, Chef Du Bois, who had been watching from his office, pale and frozen. "Her employment here is terminated. Effective immediately." Chef Du Bois just nodded, unable to form words. Evelyn stared, her mouth agape. "You can't. Who do you think you are?" Akio turned his back on her, a dismissal more profound than any insult. He looked at Naomi again. "Get your things. We're leaving." He walked out of the kitchen without a backward glance. His two men materialized on either side of a terrified Evelyn, their presence a silent, immovable wall, and escorted her out of the kitchen and toward the front of the restaurant. Naomi stood rooted to the spot, the entire kitchen staff staring at her with a mixture of awe and fear. Her identity, the secret she had guarded so carefully, was blown. She was no longer Naomi, the promising new chef. She was the woman the most dangerous man in Tokyo had just torn a restaurant apart for. She slowly began to unbutton the borrowed jacket, her hands trembling slightly. Her quiet life was over. The sanctuary had burned down. The ride home was silent. The interior of the black sedan was like a sensory deprivation chamber, soundproof, with tinted windows that turned the vibrant Tokyo cityscape into a muted, distant film. Akio sat beside her, not touching, but his presence filled the space, a dense field of controlled fury. He stared straight ahead, his profile carved from stone. Naomi watched the city lights slide by, feeling the chasm between that world and this one grow wider with every passing meter. In the sterile perfection of their penthouse, the silence stretched, louder than any argument. He disappeared into their bedroom and returned with a small, lacquered box. He opened it, revealing a sterile medical kit. He gestured to the sofa. "Seat." She obeyed, perching on the edge of the white leather cushion. He knelt before her, a startling act of deference from a man who bowed to no one. He gently unbuttoned the top of her shirt, his movements precise and impersonal, like a doctor's. He exposed the burn. It was a nasty red blotch against her dark skin, already starting to blister in the center. He cleaned it with an antiseptic wipe, his touch incredibly gentle. His focus was absolute. As he worked, he spoke, his voice low and devoid of emotion. "Disrespect is a seed," he said, his eyes on her skin. "When it is planted in my soil, it grows into a tree of poison. Its roots spread, choking everything. You cannot let it grow." He paused, dabbing a soothing salve onto the burn. His fingers were cool against her heated skin. "I once let such a seed grow," he continued, his voice dropping even lower. "A small insult to my sister, years ago. I thought it was beneath me to retaliate. The man who insulted her was insignificant. A week later, he saw her again. He thought because I had done nothing, he could do anything." He stopped speaking, but the story hung in the air between them, thick with unspoken tragedy. Naomi knew the story of his sister, Heisi, taken from him because of who he was, because of a rival's cruelty that he had underestimated. It was the one wound he carried that never healed, the source of his shame, the engine of his cold, calculating control. He would never fail to protect a woman in his care again. He would burn the world down first. "It wasn't your fault," she whispered, the words inadequate. His eyes, dark and haunted, finally met hers. "Every moment of inaction has a consequence, Naomi. Today, a woman put her hands on you. She harmed you. If I allow that, tomorrow another will think they can do more." He finished dressing the wound, his work meticulous. He stood up, the moment of vulnerability passing as quickly as it had come. His face was a mask again. "You will not go back there. It was my job," she said, the protest weak even to her own ears. "It was mine." "No," he said, the word absolute. "You are mine. That is your reality. It is time you accepted it." The next day, Naomi learned what Akio's brand of consequence looked like. It wasn't just that Evelyn was fired. A series of anonymous tips led to a full-scale health and safety audit of Ori. The restaurant was shut down indefinitely for dozens of violations, some real, some fabricated with the help of officials on Akio's payroll. Chef Dubois's reputation was ruined. Evelyn Reed, Naomi discovered through a hushed call from a former co-worker, was facing charges for tax evasion, a skeleton from her past that Akio's people had unearthed and delivered to the authorities in a neat little package. Her life was being surgically dismantled, piece by piece. Naomi watched it unfold from the sterile beauty of the penthouse, a gilded cage with a breathtaking view. The scale of the destruction, all for a splash of hot soup, made her feel sick. This was the power she had married into, the power she had tried to pretend didn't define her. One evening, seeing the sheer, soul-crushing terror in a news photo of Evelyn leaving a police station, Naomi made a choice. She found Akio in his study, a room of dark wood and glass that overlooked the glittering city. He was staring out the window, a glass of whiskey in his hand. "Stop," she said, her voice clear and steady. He turned to look at her, one eyebrow raised slightly. "What you're doing to her? To the restaurant?" "It's enough," she said, her heart pounding. She was challenging him, stepping into his world on his terms. "It has to stop." He took a slow sip of his whiskey, his eyes never leaving hers. The silence stretched, heavy and charged. He was weighing her, judging her words. "Why?" he asked simply. "Because she's nothing," Naomi said, the realization coming to her as she spoke. She was a bitter woman in a small job. You've turned her into a martyr. This devastation, it gives her an importance she never earned. It makes the story about her. Don't give her that. Let her just be what she is, a pathetic woman who lost her job. He stared at her for a long time, the ice in his eyes seeming to thaw for just a moment. He saw her then, not as a possession to be protected, but as a queen with her own strategy, her own understanding of power. It was not about mercy. It was about narrative, about control. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "As you wish." He turned back to the window. The next day, the pressure on Ori and on Evelyn Reed vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared. The charges were dropped. The audit ceased. But the damage was done. The seed of disrespect had been plucked from the ground, its roots severed. Naomi had stayed when she could have been silent. She had helped, in her own way, by reining him in. She thought she had averted a crisis. What she didn't know was that her intervention had been noticed. The owner of Ori, a man named Kenji Sato, was deeply in debt to a rival Yakuza clan, the Ozakigumi. Seeing Tanaka's uncharacteristic and public display over a kitchen worker, and then the sudden reversal, Sato saw an opportunity. He went to the Ozakigumi and told them that the great Akio Tanaka had a weakness. A black girl who could make him act on emotion. A lever that could be pulled. The ripples from that single, malicious splash of soup were no longer ripples. They were the first stirrings of a tsunami. The first sign that the danger had escalated beyond a petty rivalry came not as a whisper, but as a roar. Naomi had gone back to Ori one last time, with Akio's reluctant permission, to collect her knives and personal effects. The restaurant was a ghost ship, dark and empty. As she carefully wrapped her prized santoku in its leather sheath, the air grew thick with the smell of gasoline. Then came the explosion. The front of the restaurant erupted in a ball of fire, shattering the plate glass windows and sending a shockwave that threw her to the floor. The world became a maelstrom of heat, smoke, and the scream of twisting metal. The attack was not subtle. It was a message, written in flames. The Ozakigumi were announcing their interest. Naomi's training kicked in. Not her chef's training, but the other, harsher training Akio's security had drilled into her. Stay low. Find an exit. Do not panic. She crawled through the smoke-filled kitchen, her lungs burning. The back door was blocked by debris. She was trapped. Just as a wave of true, primal fear began to crest, a section of the wall beside the walk-in freezer imploded inward. A figure in a dark, fire-retardant suit smashed through, followed by two more. It was Akio's personal guard. One of them found her, swept her up without a word, and carried her through the breach they'd created. Outside, in the chaos of sirens and flashing lights, Akio was waiting. He wasn't in a suit. He wore black cargo pants and a tight black t-shirt, and for the first time, she could see the full, terrifying artistry of the tattoos covering his arms, dragons and peonies, symbols of power and ephemeral beauty. The mask of calm was gone. His face was a thundercloud of raw fury. He took her from his man's arms, his grip on her almost painful. He searched her for injuries, his hands moving over her with a desperate urgency. Finding her covered in soot but physically unharmed, his control finally fractured. He pulled her against his chest, his arms wrapping around her like steel bands, burying his face in her hair. "I should never have let you leave the house," he rasped, his voice thick with a terrifying blend of rage and relief. It was the closest he had ever come to admitting fear. In the days that followed, their penthouse became a war room. Naomi was a prisoner in her own home, guarded day and night. She overheard snippets of conversation, plans for a devastating retaliation against the Ozakigumi, a war that would paint the streets of Shinjuku red. She knew Akio's rage would be surgical but all-consuming. She also knew who had lit the fuse, Kenji Sato, the restaurant's owner. One night, unable to sleep, she slipped into Akio's study. His laptop was open. With a few clicks, she was past his security. He had taught her the back doors himself, and into his private files. She found everything. The complete dossier on Sato, his debts, his criminal affiliations, his secret ledgers. Akio was planning to use it, but only after his initial violent strike. Naomi felt a cold resolve settle over her. A war would endanger him, his men, and countless innocents. There was another way. A cleaner, colder way. She copied the files onto a secure, encrypted drive. She remembered a journalist she had known from a past life, a dogged reporter with a reputation for taking down powerful men. Using a burner phone, she sent him an anonymous, untraceable email with the entire package. The subject line was simple: "The man who burned down Ori." She had crossed a line. This wasn't self-defense. It was a calculated act of destruction, using the very tools of the world she claimed to despise. She had sentenced Kenji Sato to a life of public ruin and imprisonment to protect Akio. She had become a player in the game. Akio found out within hours. His intelligence network was absolute. He didn't storm in yelling. He entered the living room where she sat waiting and simply looked at her, his face an unreadable cipher. The data stick with the files she had copied was in his hand. "This was you," he stated, his voice quiet. She met his gaze without flinching. "I stopped a war." "You started a different one," he countered, though there was no anger in his voice. There was something else. Awe. And a sliver of fear. He walked closer, stopping in front of her. "You have my fire in your veins," he said, his voice a low vibration. "But you shape it differently. It terrifies me." "I learned it from you," she replied, her voice just as quiet, just as intense. "I learned that to protect what is yours, you cannot always be clean." That was their confession. Not of love, but of a shared, dangerous truth. An acknowledgement of the darkness they both now carried. He reached out and cupped her face, his thumb tracing her jawline. The touch was no longer just protective, it was a recognition of an equal. But her move, while brilliant, had an unintended consequence. By exposing Sato, she had publicly humiliated the Ozaki-gumi, revealing their pawn and thwarting their plans. Their leader, a brutal traditionalist named Ozaki, could not let this stand. He had underestimated the woman. He saw now that she wasn't Tanaka's weakness. She was his queen. And in their world, to win the game, you took the other king's queen off the board. His next move would not be against Akio. It would be directly at her. The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon. The caller ID was blocked. When Naomi answered, the voice on the other end was thin and reedy with terror. It was Evelyn Reed. "Please," she whimpered. "You have to help me. They have me. They said to tell you to come to the old fish market at Tsukiji. Alone. If you tell anyone, they'll kill me." Naomi's blood ran cold. It was a trap. A clumsy, obvious trap. The Ozaki-gumi were using the woman who had started it all as bait. Her first instinct was to go to Akio. He would descend on the fish market with an army, and a bloodbath would ensue. He would get her back, but the cost would be a full-scale war, exactly what she had just worked to prevent. There was another way, a riskier, more treacherous path. Her own path. "Where at the market?" Naomi asked, her voice impossibly calm. "Give me the address." She wrote it down. After she hung up, she did not go to Akio. She went back to his study. She made one more copy of the files on Kenji Sato, but this time, she added something new. Evidence she had found of direct financial links between Sato and Ozaki's second-in-command, a man known to be ruthlessly ambitious. She had found a crack in their foundation. She was going to break it open. She walked into the abandoned warehouse at the disused end of the fish market, the smell of old brine and decay thick in the air. She was alone, just as they'd asked. Ozaki was there, a mountain of a man in a traditional kimono, surrounded by a dozen of his soldiers. Evelyn Reed was huddled in a corner, weeping. Ozaki smiled, a cruel slash in his broad face. "The brave little queen comes for the pawn. Your husband is not as smart as they say, to let you walk in here alone." Naomi stopped in the center of the vast, damp room. She met his gaze, her own unflinching. "I didn't come for her," she said, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. "I came for you." She held up the small, black data stick. "My husband is a man of honor, in his own way. He prefers to settle things with steel. I, on the other hand, find that messy. I prefer information." She tossed the data stick onto a grimy crate between them. "On that drive is proof that your second-in-command has been skimming from you for years, using Kenji Sato as his bagman. Proof that he was making his own side deals. Proof that he is a rat in your house." Ozaki's smile faltered. His eyes darted to his lieutenant, who paled almost instantly. "You have a choice," Naomi continued, her voice cutting through the tension. "You can start a war with the Tanaka-gumi over a burnt chef's coat and a woman you misjudged. A war that, I assure you, you will lose. or you can clean your own house. And we can forget this unfortunate business ever happened. She had laid a bomb at his feet. He could kill her, but the information was already set to be released to news outlets and law enforcement if she didn't deactivate it within the hour. He would win the battle and lose his entire organization to internal rot and public exposure. The silence was absolute. The Ozaki soldiers looked from their boss to his second-in-command, the trust between them fracturing in real time. Just then, the warehouse doors slid open with a deafening screech. Akio stood there, silhouetted against the evening light. Behind him, his men, an army of shadows, fanned out, weapons drawn but not raised. He had known. Of course, he had known she would do something like this. He had followed her, trusted her, and now he was here to back her play. He didn't move to rescue her. He simply stood at the threshold, a king watching his queen checkmate their opponent. His presence was the final weight on the scales. Ozaki looked from Naomi's calm, certain face, to the data stick, to his treacherous lieutenant, and finally to the waiting army at his door. He let out a harsh, guttural laugh. He had been completely and utterly outmaneuvered. He gave Naomi a deep, formal bow, a sign of respect, of defeat. "The debt is settled," he grunted. He turned and walked out, his men dragging the now terrified lieutenant with them. They left Evelyn Reed sobbing on the floor. In the aftermath, back in the silent penthouse, Akio carefully cleaned a small cut on Naomi's cheek from a piece of flying debris she hadn't even noticed. He didn't praise her. He didn't scold her for the risk she'd taken. He finished cleaning the cut, his touch gentle, and met her eyes in the reflection of the window overlooking the city. "The Empress," he said, his voice quiet but resonant with a new truth, "does not rule from behind the Emperor. She rules beside him." It was not a declaration of love. It was an acknowledgement, a coronation. He was no longer her protector. She was his partner. The cost had been paid. Evelyn Reed was given a quiet, comfortable retirement far away, a loose and neatly tied up. Naomi never asked. She didn't need to. The last vestiges of her old life, her desire for normalcy, were gone, burned away in the fire at the restaurant. The next morning, she no longer reached for a chef's jacket. Dressed in a simple but elegant silk dress, she stood behind him as he prepared to leave, her hands moving with familiar precision to straighten the knot of his black silk tie. Her hands, once dusted with flour and scented with herbs, now adjusted the collar of the most powerful man in the city. She looked at their reflection in the mirror, the imposing Yakuza boss in his tailored armor, and the woman at his side, her eyes clear and calm. She had traded her kitchen for a kingdom, her knives for strategy. She had once thought this world a cage. Now, looking at the man whose tie she held, whose empire she had just saved, she saw the truth. It was not a cage. It was a throne, and she was finally ready to take her seat.